Well, good morning to you again, and welcome to the second of our talks about Paul's letter to the Galatians. Yesterday we looked at chapter 1 and we looked at the character and the calling of Paul. Today we move on to chapter 2, and today is really about the efforts that Paul went to make sure that the clarity of his message to the Galatians was understood by everyone. He wanted to make sure there was no confusion and there was no misunderstanding, and that the Gentiles could rest assured that what he was saying to them had some legitimacy. Today's reading comes from Galatians chapter 2, and let me read to you some selected verses from that chapter. Chapter 2, beginning to read at verse 1. 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. As for those who seem to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by external appearance. Those men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. And they agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. But when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews pointed him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners know that a man is not justified by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ, and not by observing the law, because by observing the law no one will be justified." And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, Paul really wants his Gentile audience in Galatia to hear the truth of the Christian gospel. That salvation comes through our faith in Jesus and not by sticking rigidly to any Jewish laws. Our salvation is a gift from God, paid for through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. We don't work for it. And today Paul begins to gather his evidence together so that he can put forward a very persuasive case to the Gentiles. Let's have a look how he does that. Well, first of all, he told them that he had gone to Jerusalem in response to a nudge from God, that he had taken his friends Barnabas and Titus to Jerusalem, to the very mission control of the Jewish church. And there they had met privately with very prominent Jewish church leaders, and they had told them all about the message that they were preaching to the Gentiles. Paul wanted them to hear from the horse's mouth what he was saying to the Gentiles. He didn't want them to be misunderstood. He didn't want them to be confused in any way. His message to the Gentiles was clear and it was unambiguous. Put simply, that anyone could be offered God's salvation regardless of their race, their sex, their nationality, their wealth, their social standing, or anything else. Anyone could be made right with God through their faith in Jesus. Now, this was clearly very radical stuff to some Jewish ears. But none of those eminent Jewish leaders could contradict what Paul was saying to them. They could see for themselves that Paul had been called by God and that he had been entrusted to preach the good news to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been called to preach to the Jews. And they could see too that Paul was essentially preaching the same message as them, about the centrality of a faith in Jesus. Where they differed was on the significance of sticking to the Jewish laws in addition to their faith in Jesus. But what a good move that was on Paul's part, inspired by God, but he had taken the gospel to the very heart of the Jewish church, from where opposition was most likely to come. And yet, said Paul, those Jewish leaders said nothing to contradict what I was saying to the Gentiles. He had opened up communication channels so that Jews and Gentiles alike wouldn't be confused or have any confusion at all about their respective roles. Paul respected that God was at work in the work of Peter with the Jews, and he wanted them to respect that God was at work in his work with the Gentiles. Paul wouldn't compromise his message in any way, and he taught us how, as Christian disciples, we can learn to disagree with those that have different views to ours. What Paul was doing was actually cultivating mutual respect between himself and the Jewish leaders. And when we often do that, when we go out of our way to try and reconcile ourselves with those who hold fundamentally different views, we find very often that the things that separate us are in fact quite little. There's a lesson, I think, there for the modern church, certainly, that we should be recognising and encouraging the mutual flourishing of all ministries that are God-centred and Jesus-driven, and not just those ministries that we're content and comfortable with. So, says Paul to the Gentiles, not even those prominent Jewish leaders can find fault with my gospel to you. They recognise that God is at work here amongst the Galatian churches. But what else? What else does Paul do to persuade his Gentile audience of the new gospel? Well, he draws the Gentiles' attention to what he has seen with his own eyes within the Jewish church. There was muddle amongst them. They were hypocritical. Although they might be God-centred, they seem to have lost their way with the gospel. And in particular, Paul tells the Gentiles he'd met with Peter, perhaps the most prominent Jewish apostle of the time, in Antioch. And there he had directly opposed him in public and highlighted to Peter his inconsistency and his hypocrisy. Paul strongly emphasised to the Gentiles that we all need to be clear, we all need to be consistent about our gospel. People get confused when there is ambiguity. People get confused when they see eminent church leaders like Peter acting in a hypocritical way. And isn't that so true today? That people still regard many of us and many of our churches as being hypocritical. It's so destructive. It's the one hurtful label that gets thrown at us time and time again. It confuses them about everything, but especially about the Christian truth and where we stand in relation to that truth. Well, Paul ends this letter today by repeating the Christian good news to the Gentiles. Be clear about this, he says. You were born Gentiles, not Jews. You don't need to become Jews in order to become followers of Jesus. You don't need to follow the Jewish laws. Observance of those laws doesn't make us right with God. Only our faith in Jesus does that. Well, as the letter develops, it gets more and more complex. And tomorrow we're going to be exploring a slightly more complex and difficult chapter. I hope you'll be able to join me for chapter 3 tomorrow. Same time, same place. In the meantime, have a good day